Phil X always said he could talk about guitars all day, but there was one moment in his life that changed everything. It happened in a short backstage conversation with Eddie Van Halen, a moment so powerful that Phil still talks about it like it happened yesterday. On that day, he wasn't the rock star replacing Richie Sambora in Bon Jovi. He wasn't the YouTube guitar hero millions admired. He was simply a kid again, standing in front of the guitarist who rewrote the rules of rock music. Eddie didn't just play guitar, he reinvented it. And Phil knew this was his chance to understand something deeper. What Eddie told him wasn't a tone secret, a pickup setting, or a tapping trick. It was something most guitar players never think about. Something Eddie believed separated real players from the ones who just chase sound. Phil expected Eddie to talk about amps, fingers, or gear. Instead, Eddie leaned in and said something that surprised him so much he still repeats it in every interview where Eddie's name comes up. That short message became the foundation of Phil's entire guitar philosophy, from the way he practices, to the way he performs, to the way he thinks about sound. And what was that message? Phil says it wasn't about notes. It was about purpose. Eddie told him something that felt less like guitar advice and more like life advice, something that forced Phil to rethink everything he thought he knew about music. In that moment, he realized he had spent years focusing on the wrong thing. He finally understood what Eddie meant later, but the lesson would change the direction of his career forever. Phil X grew up obsessed with technique. He believed fast fingers, precision, and control were the ultimate signs of a great guitarist. Like many players, he tried to copy Eddie Van Halen's style, the tapping, the harmonics, the impossible runs. But Eddie didn't see it that way. When Phil met him, he was shocked by how relaxed Eddie was. No ego, no show-off attitude, no rock star tone discussion. Eddie cared about something else entirely. Phil remembers Eddie smiling and saying, "You can't think too much. You have to feel more than you play." At first, Phil didn't fully get what that meant, but it stuck in his head like a riff you hear once and can't unhear. Phil kept replaying those words, trying to understand them. He later realized Eddie wasn't talking about speed or accuracy. He was talking about intent. Eddie believed the real magic didn't come from what your fingers were doing, but from why you were doing it. Technique could make you skilled, but intention made you unforgettable. And this is where everything clicked for Phil. He had spent years chasing Eddie's techniques, but Eddie himself wasn't focused on technique at all. He was focused on emotion, on attitude, on identity. And that became the beginning of Phil's transformation, from a guitar player chasing perfection to a musician chasing meaning. Eddie Van Halen surprised Phil when he said he didn't worry much about gear. This was unbelievable to Phil, who thought Eddie had some secret amp, some magical pickup, some combination nobody else knew. But Eddie told him, "Tone is in your hands." Phil heard this idea before, but not the way Eddie explained it. Eddie didn't mean fingers alone. He meant personality. The attack, the touch, the pressure, the confidence. All of it lived inside the player. Phil began experimenting with his picking, vibrato, and timing. Suddenly he realized he could sound like himself, even on a cheap rig. Eddie's message was right. Tone isn't something you buy, it's something you develop. And Phil finally understood the root of Eddie's genius. Phil X always believed clean playing was the goal. But Eddie changed that. Eddie said, "Mistakes show who you are." Phil couldn't believe this at first, but Eddie explained that the little imperfections, the slides, the noise, the odd bends, give personality to a performance. After that, Phil stopped trying to polish every note. Instead, he embraced the rough edges that made his playing unique. That freedom made him more confident than ever. Eddie told Phil that a guitar solo should feel like a conversation, not a competition. Phil started shaping his solos like chapters, not exercises. He focused on tension, release, surprise, and emotion. He learned that people don't remember solos because they're fast. They remember how solos make them feel. This changed the way Phil wrote and performed forever. Eddie believed a guitar shouldn't be too easy. Phil remembers Eddie smiling and saying, "If it fights you, it teaches you." Phil realized his setups were too perfect, too smooth. He started playing guitars that pushed him, made him work, and forced him to grow. Harder guitars made him a stronger, more expressive player. Eddie told Phil that complexity means nothing without creativity. Phil began focusing on simple ideas played in meaningful ways, like Eddie did with riffs such as "Ain't Talkin' About Love." Phil discovered the power of simplicity and how great music comes from strong ideas, not overwhelming technique. Eddie Van Halen didn't follow rules. He rewrote them. Phil learned that staying inside the lines makes you invisible. Eddie encouraged experimentation, different tunings, weird techniques, unusual chord shapes. Phil adopted this mindset and began creating sounds he never imagined before. Phil realized Eddie's music always carried emotion first. Every vibrato, every dive bomb, every note had feeling. Phil embraced this idea. He stopped worrying about impressing other guitar players. Instead, he focused on touching listeners, the real goal of music. Eddie told Phil the guitar isn't a tool, it's a voice. And like any voice, it must have character. Phil started treating his guitar tone like a human expression: whispers, shouts, laughter, anger. This shift gave his playing depth he never had before. Years later, Phil X finally understood Eddie's lesson fully. Play with intention, not imitation. This became Phil's personal motto. He stopped chasing Eddie's tone and instead embraced who he was meant to be. The invaluable lesson Eddie gave him wasn't about guitar gear or technique. It was about identity, and it transformed Phil X into the player the world knows today.